Hello, mates. Welcome to Budgie Keat Gaming. I'm your host, Finley. I know you already saw the title and thumbnail, so you already know some of the info that'll be in this video, which is that the Switch 2 failed to meet sales expectations for the 2025 holiday season, so I'll go over that info very quickly. But what I'll also be doing is going over the reasons as to why this happened. Real quick before I get started, if you like this type of content, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. It's a huge help for small channels like mine. Articles are quoting a Nintendo employee simply brushing it off as a complicated economic landscape and the absence of a major Western game, which I'll be going over both of those statements in a little bit. But they are missing quite a few major factors that also contributed to this failure. Now, before you all start freaking out, no, I'm not a Nintendo hater. I actually own the Switch 2 and some games for it, but I also have no issue pointing out their glaring mistakes. I'm also not going to get on here pretending that the Switch 2 is a massive failure, because as of now, we all know that's not the case. Basically what it comes down to is the sales for the Switch 2 for its first holiday season are down when compared to the sale figures for the original Switch during its first holiday season. And this isn't only in parts of the world, this is nearly global. When compared to the original Switch's first holiday season, the Switch 2 sold 35% less than the original Switch in the US. In the UK, Switch 2 was down 16%. In France, Switch 2 sales were over 30% lower. And lastly, in Japan, the sales were down around 5.5%. So what exactly led to this nearly universal issue for Nintendo? Let's first go over the reasons Nintendo thinks are the issues. The first issue they point out is a complicated economic landscape, which is an extremely vague way to sidestep a mountain of issues that are all intertwined. I will also be pointing out a reason as to why this logic doesn't make sense later in the video. Going back to Nintendo's economic comment, bullshit tariffs are the most glaring issue when thinking about economic issues. They rightfully blamed the tariffs for the rising cost of amiibos, so it's safe to assume tariffs raised the cost of games, accessories, and the console itself. By how much? No one really knows, but it's clear it had an impact. But I think another issue, and one that Nintendo will never admit, is their greed. Amiibos raising from $16 to $30, $40, and even $50 already seems a little excessive, even when accounting for tariffs. But the main issue of Nintendo's greed comes with the games and DLC. After playing it for nearly 30 hours, I can absolutely promise you that there was no reason for Mario Kart World to cost $80, nearly $90 once you account for taxes, and in some countries, well over $100. While it's a fun game, it shouldn't have been more than $70, especially when considering the amount of content in this game. Underwhelming DLC from both Donkey Kong Bonanza and Pokémon Z through A, costing $20 to $30, making each game cost $90 respectively to get the full experience, is also ridiculous. I would also point towards Zelda when it comes to Nintendo's greed. Why do we have to pay $10 for graphical updates for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom when all the other Nintendo games received free graphical updates? I'm sorry, but that little app and a graphical update is absolutely not worth $10 when all the other Nintendo titles are getting free graphical updates. And I get it, it's DLC. You don't have to buy it if you don't want to. But that doesn't negate from the fact that the DLC is grossly overpriced. The biggest ripoff of all, ironically, cost only $10, but it was the biggest bitch slap of greed anyone has ever seen, and that is Welcome Tour. How the hell does such an awful-looking tech demo cost $10? Just mind-blowing, really. Nintendo can blame the economy all they want, and I honestly agree with them, but they can't sit there and act like none of it had to do with their greed that forced so many gamers away from the Switch 2. The other comment that was said is, the absence of a major Western game also played a role in the lower Switch 2 sales. For starters, that is on Nintendo for releasing Metroid Prime 4 in December. That's almost unheard of for a major release. The game should have been released between October or November, or just pushed back to 2026 if they couldn't make the date. And judging by the reception, they probably could have used the extra time. And if we're being totally honest, this doesn't just fall on Metroid Prime 4. Kirby Air Riders and Hyrule Warriors really aren't any better for a holiday release. And when we zoom out for the entire year, all the Switch 2 got for the entire year was Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Prime 4, Kirby Air Riders, Pokémon Z, and Hyrule Warriors for the entire year, 2 of which can be played on the original Switch. While that's an okay lineup, what did we get for the first year for the Nintendo Switch? Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, Mario Kart 8, Mario and Rabbids, Splatoon 2, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Pokken Tournament XD, ARMS, and so many third-party ports like Skyrim and Stardew Valley. The issue wasn't the absence of a major Western game. The issue was the absence of a must-play title for the entire year. And I'm sorry, but a half-baked Mario Kart and a Donkey Kong platformer can't compete with the games that were released for the original Switch in its first year. Now that we've moved past the comments made by Nintendo, the most obvious reason for sales failing to meet expectations is because the original Switch is still doing really well. Globally, the original Switch managed to sell 385,000 consoles in November and about 782,000 consoles in December. That's over 1 million Switch consoles sold in just the last 2 months alone. Could this be because of economic issues, lack of games issues, pricing issues? It's hard to say, but in the end, does it even matter? Over 1 million people decided it was better to buy a nearly 10-year-old console over a console that is 6 months old. And it's not even like the original Switch has its own ecosystem of games. The Switch 2 can play everything, at least everything that matters, on the Switch 2 as well. And like I mentioned earlier, 2 of the holiday titles for the Switch 2 could be played on the original Switch. Why would you buy a Switch 2 when a good portion of the heavy-hitting games can still be played on the original Switch? Remember earlier when I said there was a flaw in Nintendo's logic when blaming it on complicated economics? Well, that brings me to my next topic, and it's something that Nintendo wouldn't admit. But Sony absolutely leveled Nintendo on a global scale when it comes to the most recent holiday sales. The reason I feel like pricing isn't an issue, for some people at least, is because of the amount of people who decided to spend $50 more on a PS5 over a Switch 2. Now, I know a lot of charts are only counting December as holiday sales, which I understand since that is the month of the actual holiday. But to me, I count November, since you have the biggest shopping week of the year at the end of that month. And my God, did Sony crush it for November. Not only did the PS5 beat the Switch 2, it sold nearly double the amount of Switch 2 consoles, with the PS5 around 3.5 million units and the Switch 2 at 1.82 million units. It gets a little bit better for the Switch 2 in December, where it sold a little over 3.8 million units, with the PS5 not too far behind, being just shy of 3.4 million units. Now I know the PS5 is far more powerful, with tons more games and must-play titles. But a 5-year-old console shouldn't be out selling a brand new console nearly 2-to-1 during the most busy shopping month of the year. The next thing I want to talk about kind of ties in the games released for the Switch 2, but goes a bit deeper than that as this section is divided into 3 subcategories. Those categories being game keycards, game performance, and third-party support. The first I want to talk about is game keycards, along with the overuse of game keycards by third-party developers. I know there are a lot of you that do not give a shit one way or another about this topic, but like it or not, there are a lot of people that do care. Even if those people are a small percentage of Nintendo fans, a small percentage of original Switch owners is still a shit ton of people. Unless you have a Dragon Quest logo on the cover, your game is probably going to sell like shit on the Switch 2 if it's a game key card, and I'm not even joking with that statement. The Dragon Quest 1 and 2 HD 2D remake is literally the only game key card that regularly makes the bestsellers list for the Switch 2. Everything else is either charting for a week and quickly drops off, or doesn't even make the list at all. Which really isn't a surprise, considering third-party developers said themselves that their games, which were mostly game key cards, sold below their lowest estimates. This also ties in with the cost issue, because if you're buying game key cards, you're using far more memory, because game key cards are quite literally a digital game wrapped in a physical package. These games take up tons of space, which requires the player to spend hundreds of dollars on memory cards just to store these so-called physical games. Basically, the Switch 2 is alienating all gamers who are collectors by 1. Not having the actual game on the cart, and 2. Making collectors spend far more money on memory cards, since, like I said earlier, game key cards take up a ton of memory, and collectors always have a massive library, meaning they'll be eating that memory up quite fast. Especially when you have third-party developers who have no clue on how to optimize their games, like Split Fiction at a massive 70+ gigabytes. That's over a quarter of the built-in memory on a Switch 2 for one game. And this goes right into the next topic, third-party support, or the lack of third-party support. Yes, we got a ton of games at launch, especially when it comes to third-party games. But you know a funny thing about those third-party games? I could have played most of them on a PS 4 years ago, in some cases, nearly 10 years ago, and those games were fully on disc. Third-party developers essentially thought they could add some half-baked multiplayer modes or DLC characters to an older game, slap the game on a keycard and charge you anywhere between $40 to $60 when you could have easily bought a better-looking and better-running version of the game on another system, all while costing you at least half the price of the Switch 2 version. I'm not exactly sure what the upcharge is for. To own it on a Nintendo system? To play it in handheld mode? I'm sorry, but that is absolutely not worth it to me. And based on the sales of games that use game keycards, it's pretty clear a lot of people feel the same way I do. Like I mentioned earlier, third-party games that used game keycards bombed on the Switch 2 release, and quite frankly, the entire year, with the exception of Dragon Quest HD 2D and Final Fantasy Tactics. The last quick thing I want to mention is game performance on the Switch 2. A lot of third-party games on the Switch 2 run at 30 frames per second. While I'm not much of a stickler for frames per second, I know many people are. What makes the 30 frames per second so bad is a lot of these games that are running at 30 frames per second on the Switch 2 are running at 60 frames per second on other consoles, which is such the case for games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Final Fantasy VII Remake. We also have games like Hitman, World of Assassination, and Demon X Machina, who have FPS issues, and I'm not talking about 30 FPS. I'm talking lower than that. Even worse, these games are known for having crashing issues. Even to some extent, Donkey Kong Bonanza, a first-party game, is having some stuttering issues and frame rate dips, which is insanely uncommon for a first-party game from Nintendo. If first-party games are already having minor performance issues, what is it going to be like a few years down the road? Especially when we get games that are far more demanding than Donkey Kong. We also have third-party games who refuse to use unique features from the Switch 2, such as touchscreen or mouse play. Games such as Two Point Museum, Ball Pit, and Final Fantasy Tactics should absolutely have the option of using mouse mode. If third-party developers cannot get their games running at 60 frames per second, or at least make up for it by using the Switch 2's unique features, then why would anyone buy a Switch 2 for third-party games that release later, cost more and look worse on the Switch 2? And while I'll give the Switch 2 credit that it can actually run a lot of third-party games decently, even demanding games that run on the PS5 and Xbox, they still look drastically worse on the Switch 2. And it's only going to get worse the farther we get into this generation's life cycle. Even more so whenever the PS6 releases, which is probably less than 3 years away. So yeah, to sum this section up, there isn't much reason to buy a Switch 2 for third-party games when the games look worse, run worse, cost more, and aren't even fully in the cartridge. Oh, and before anyone makes the comment, which someone always does on these types of videos, PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 games, for the most part, are fully on disc. If you don't believe me, look it up on doesitplay.org. All right now, so what do you think of all of this? Why do you think the Switch 2 didn't sell as many consoles as the Switch 1 during its first holiday season? Do you think this is something Nintendo should be worried about? Let me know down in the comment section below, and again, please consider hitting like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. Until next time, take care, mates.